The man they brought in at 9 p.m. on a Thursday didn't beg. That was the first thing people noticed about Dante Calabrese. Not the silence, not the stillness, not the way he occupied a room like weather. It was the absence of pleading. In 34 years of living inside a world built on fear, Dante had learned that begging was a language spoken only by people who still believed mercy was available. He had long since stopped believing that. The port official sat across from him in the back room of a restaurant that didn't appear on any city register. A heavyset man in his mid-50s named Gerald, who had skimmed $40,000 in product over the course of 11 months and somehow convinced himself that distance and paperwork would keep him safe. Gerald was crying. He had been crying for some time. Dante watched him with the calm expression of a man reviewing a mildly disappointing quarterly report. "I can get it back," Gerald said. "Every dollar. Give me 60 days." Dante said nothing. He picked up his glass of sparkling water, turned it once in his fingers, and set it back down. 60 days, Gerald repeated, as if the number itself might save him. Dante looked at the man to his left, his cousin Sal, broad-shouldered and quiet, and gave the smallest possible nod. What happened next was efficient and without theater. That was how Dante preferred most things. He was back in his car by 9:40. He didn't plan to stop at Sette that night. Sette was one of 43 properties that ran beneath the surface of his financial life, a members-only lounge in Betrayal that served as both a legitimate revenue stream and a useful place to conduct conversations that required leather chairs, low lighting, and the assurance that no one in the building would ask questions. He owned it through 6 layers of corporate architecture. His name appeared nowhere near it. He stopped there out of habit, the way a man stops at a particular corner without remembering when it became a ritual, and took his usual table near the back, where the sight lines were good and the exits were clear. The bar was 3/4 full. A jazz quartet played something unhurried in the corner. Dante loosened the second button of his shirt, the single concession he made toward comfort in public, and his usual sparkling water appeared at the table before he asked for it. He looked up. He had never looked up before. The drink always simply arrived, left by whoever was working, and he never registered the hand that brought it. But something made him look up that particular Tuesday, some small disruption in the rhythm of the evening, the way you look up from a page when a room goes fractionally quieter. The woman behind the bar was not looking at him. That was the first thing he noticed. Every other person in the room was performing at some level for his presence, the subtle adjustments people made when they knew who he was, the careful choreography of pretending not to watch. The woman behind the bar was watching a man 3 stools down who was explaining something with his hands, and she had the expression of someone who had heard this exact argument before and was deciding whether it was worth the energy to win it. She said something. The man stopped talking. She went back to wiping down the bar. Dante kept watching her. She was not a beautiful woman in the way Miami packaged beauty, constructed, polished, designed for rooms exactly like this one. She was something more inconvenient than that. She moved like she was comfortable in her own body and unbothered by anyone else's opinion of it. When she laughed, it was brief and real and not aimed at anyone in particular. He realized he had been watching her for 6 minutes. He did not, as a rule, watch people for 6 minutes. Sal slid into the seat across from him, said something about the night's business, and paused. "You all right, boss?" Dante picked up his water, set it back down. "Order something. We're staying a while." He didn't look away from the bar. That was the first mistake Dante Calabrese ever made he couldn't take back. Her name, for the purposes of this assignment, was Sloan Vega. That part was real. The name, the New Mexico driver's license, the bartending certification earned at a community college in Albuquerque 8 years before she ever set foot inside a federal building. What was not real was the reason she was in Miami. What was not real was the woman she became every evening she walked behind that bar, tied her apron, and waited for the kind of people who moved money in the dark to come sit in the light and drink. Special Agent Sloan Vega had been with the anti-drug trafficking organization for 7 years. She had worked 3 embedded operations before this one, 2 of them in cities she still couldn't talk about, one of them that ran 14 months and ended with a conviction that made the papers without her name appearing anywhere in the coverage. That was the job. You built the case, someone else took the photograph at the press conference. You moved on to the next one. This was supposed to be the next one. 18 months she had spent building toward Sete, cultivating the bartending work history, getting planted in 2 other brickle establishments first to establish a presence in the neighborhood, learning the geography of Miami's nightlife the way you learn a language by living inside it rather than studying it from a distance. By the time she walked behind the bar at Sete, she knew which properties in a 3-mile radius were clean and which were laundered. She knew which faces belonged to which organizations, and she knew that whoever sat at the center of Sete's ownership structure was the thread that, if pulled correctly, would unravel the most sophisticated domestic trafficking network the ADTO had tracked in a decade. She just didn't have a face for the center yet. Her handler, Agent Brett Calloway, ran the operation from a field office in Coral Gables. 12 years in federal law enforcement, 2 commendations, and the particular brand of controlled patience that came from working cases that moved like weather systems, slow and total. Brett was good at this work. He trusted Sloan completely, which was both a professional assessment and a weight she carried. The Tuesday Dante Calabrese walked into Sete, Brett texted her at 9:47 p.m. Him. Just that. One word. Sloan was mid-conversation with a member at the far end of the bar, and she read the text in a single downward glance without breaking eye contact with the man she was talking to. She laughed at something he said, topped off his glass, and took her time walking back toward the center of the bar. She did not look directly at the back table. She had learned early in her first embedded operation that the instinct to immediately study a target was the most reliable way to burn a cover. Instead, she worked the bar, filled 2 orders, wiped down the counter, handled a tab dispute with the bored efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times, and assembled the picture of the man in the back from peripheral information. The way the room reorganized itself around his arrival, the way his associates' body language shifted from relaxed to alert the moment they were seated, the way no one approached the table without being gestured toward it first. She poured sparkling water with lime, the standing order Brett had noted in Dante Calabrese's surveillance file, and carried it to the table herself. He looked up. She had not expected him to look up. In her experience, men with that kind of power looked through people in service roles rather than at them, a habit so ingrained it functioned like architecture. But Dante Calabrese looked directly at her, and for one suspended second, she was looked at by someone who actually registered what they were seeing. She set the glass down, said nothing, and walked back to the bar. Behind her, she heard nothing, no comment to his associate, no acknowledgement of the drink. But she knew without turning around that he was still watching her, because the room had that particular quality it gets when the most powerful person in it has directed their attention somewhere specific. She pulled her phone beneath the bar and typed Brett's name. Confirmed.
I have eyes. Brett responded in under 30 seconds. Don't push. Let him come to you. Sloane set the phone down and looked up at the bottles lining along the back wall. She exhaled once, slow and controlled, the way she had been trained. Then she went back to work.
He came back on Friday. Sloane didn't mark it outwardly. No pause, no redirected attention, no tell of any kind. She was behind the bar when Dante Calabrese walked in at 10:15 with Sal and two other men whose names she didn't have yet, and she registered his arrival the same way she registered everything in this job. Quietly, completely, and without letting it show on her face. She had his sparkling water on the table before he sat down. He noticed. She could tell by the way he settled into his chair, a fractional stillness, a beat of something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. Men like Dante Calabrese were not accustomed to being anticipated. They were accustomed to being obeyed, which was a different thing entirely. Anticipation required someone paying attention to them as a person rather than as a source of instruction. It unsettled him in a way she noted and filed carefully away. She didn't go back to the table for the rest of the evening. She let a floor server handle it. That was the architecture of it. Give just enough to make him curious, then withdraw. Not coy, not calculated in any way he could identify, just naturally unavailable. She had learned that the most effective way to hold the attention of a man who commanded rooms was to behave as though you had not noticed you were in one. By the following Tuesday, he was back again. Brett called her during her afternoon before the shift. He's been there 3 times in 8 days, he said without preamble. That's not his pattern. He's averaging once a week over the past 2 years, always business adjacent. This is different. I know, Sloane said. Don't overcorrect. You're doing the right thing pulling back. I know that too. Brett was quiet for a moment. What's your read on him? Sloane thought about the way Dante had looked up from the table that first Tuesday, the quality of attention in it. He's careful, she said finally. He doesn't do anything without a reason, which means he's already asking himself why he keeps coming back. Good, said Brett. Let him keep asking. She let 3 more visits pass with the same controlled warmth, present, competent, occasionally funny in a dry way that she didn't aim at him specifically, but that landed near enough for him to catch. She learned his table preferred the corner booth when it was available. She learned that Sal ordered bourbon neat, and that the other 2 men rotated depending on what kind of meeting the evening required. She learned that Dante never ate at Sete, only drank his water, and that he tipped exactly 20% on every visit, regardless of service quality, which told her he had decided on the number in advance and saw no reason to deviate from a decision already made. It was a small thing. It told her something large about how his mind worked. On his 6th visit, he spoke to her directly for the first time beyond a table interaction. She was restocking the back shelf when she sensed him at the bar. Not heard, sensed, the way you sense a change in air pressure. She turned around and he was there, standing at the counter rather than sitting at it, which none of his men did. They always sat. Another water, he said. She looked at the full glass on his table across the room. He didn't look away. She poured it without comment and set it in front of him. He picked it up, and then, instead of returning to his table, he stood there for a moment longer than the transaction required, not hovering, not performing, just present. You've been here 3 months, he said. It was not a question. About that, she said. You never ask who anyone is. Not my business who anyone is. My business is what they're drinking. Something moved across his expression, not quite a smile, but the internal version of one, the kind that doesn't make it to the face, but changes the eyes slightly. He went back to his table. Sal watched the whole exchange from the booth with an expression Sloane caught in the back mirror, unreadable,
careful, the eyes of a man whose job was to notice things the way hers was. She turned back to the shelf and kept stacking. Later that night, alone in her apartment, she typed her debrief report and stared at the cursor for a long time before writing, "Subject is accelerating contact, maintaining position, no operational concerns." She hit send and went to bed. She always slept fine.
It happened on a Wednesday, which felt wrong in retrospect. Significant things, in Sloane's experience, had a way of announcing themselves. A shift in the operational temperature, a change in Brett's tone during briefings, some preliminary signal that the terrain was about to change. Wednesday was a slow night at Sete. The jazz quartet had a standing cancellation. Half the usual crowd was absent. By 1 a.m., the bar was down to its last 2 members, and by 1:20 it was empty, except for the staff, the low hum of the sound system, and Dante Calabrese, who had sent his men home an hour earlier and showed no indication of following them. Sloane began closing the bar. It was her routine, methodical, unhurried, the kind of muscle memory that let her mind run parallel to her hands. She wiped down the counter, ran the register, began stacking the bar stools along the near wall. She was aware of him at his table the way you are aware of weather through a window, present, noted, not yet requiring a response. Then he stood up. He crossed the room without invitation and picked up a bar stool from the far end, the ones she hadn't reached yet, and stacked it against the wall with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done physical work before and didn't need to announce it. Sloane stopped moving. His men, she knew, would have found the gesture baffling. Dante Calabrese did not stack chairs. Dante Calabrese did not occupy the same category of existence as stacked chairs. He picked up another one and said nothing. She went back to work. They cleared the bar stools in silence, and it was not uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that exists between people who had decided, without discussing it, that words would ruin something. When they were done, Sloane poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the back counter, and Dante sat on the one bar stool she had left down without being asked to, and that was how the first real conversation between them began. "New Mexico," he said. She looked at him. "You mentioned it a few weeks ago to one of the members, something about the altitude." She hadn't known he'd been listening to that conversation. She filed it away and kept her expression easy. "Born and raised," she said. "Albuquerque." "What's it like?" "Flat," she said, and then suddenly mountains. "Nowhere else looks like it." She paused. "You ever been?" "I haven't left Miami in 4 years." He said it plainly, without apology or explanation, the way you state a fact about geography. Sloane watched his face for what lived underneath it. There was something there, not regret exactly, but the settled quality of a man who had made choices that narrowed the world around him and had stopped expecting the world to widen again. "By choice?" she asked. He considered the question with more seriousness than she expected. "Mostly," he said. "That's not a full answer." "No, it's not." She should have let it go. Operationally, there was nothing to gain from the direction this conversation was heading. No names, no accounts, no usable intelligence. But she didn't let it go, and she told herself it was because keeping him talking was the job, which was true, and not because she was genuinely curious, which was also true. "Do you miss it? Leaving, going somewhere that isn't here?" He turned the water glass on the bar top, a slow quarter rotation, and looked at it rather than at her. "I miss the idea of it. Whether I'd actually enjoy it is a different question." "That's a lonely way to live." The words were out before she measured them. She didn't walk them back.
He looked at her then, directly, without the social buffer most people maintained, and for a moment the room had no architecture to it. No bar stools, no careful distance between a federal agent and her target. Just two people sitting inside an honest sentence. "Yes," he said simply, "it is." He left 20 minutes later. No dramatics, no extended goodbye. He put on his jacket, thanked her for the water she hadn't poured for him, the water that had been sitting there from earlier, and walked out into the Miami night like a man carrying something he'd grown used to the weight of. Sloane locked up. She drove to her apartment. She sat down at her kitchen table, opened her laptop, and pulled up her debrief template. Brett called before she finished the first line. "How'd it go?" "Fine," she said. "Quiet night." "Anything useful?" She stared at the empty template. "Not yet," she said. "Still building." Brett said goodnight and hung up. Sloane closed the laptop without writing a single word and sat in the quiet of her kitchen for a long time.
He asked her on a Thursday, between her second and third round of table checks, like it was a minor administrative matter he was resolving before moving on to more pressing things. "Have dinner with me." Not a question, not quite a command, something in between, the syntax of a man who was unaccustomed to uncertainty, but was in this particular moment feeling it. Sloane could tell by the way he held himself slightly straighter than usual, the almost imperceptible stiffness of someone who had prepared for a specific response and was now exposed to the possibility of a different one. She looked at him for a long moment. "When?" she said. Something in his shoulders released. "Saturday." She told him she'd think about it and walked back to the bar. She gave it 22 minutes, long enough to be genuine, short enough not to be theater, and on her next pass by his table she said, "Saturday's fine," without stopping. She texted Brett from the supply room. "He asked me to dinner, Saturday, one-on-one." Brett responded in 4 minutes. "This is good. This is exactly what we needed. What's your comfort level?" Sloane stared at that last question for longer than she should have. "Fine," she typed back. "I'm fine." He booked the restaurant out entirely. She didn't know that until she arrived Saturday evening and found the entrance staffed by 2 men she recognized from Sete and a maitre d' who was very clearly not a maitre d' in any professional sense. Inside, every table was set but empty, soft lighting running the length of the room, a string quartet in the far corner playing something she didn't recognize but that was quietly beautiful. One table near the window was set for 2. Dante was already there. He stood when she entered, which she hadn't expected. He was wearing a charcoal shirt without a jacket, the first time she had ever seen him without one, and the absence of it made him look younger and somehow more dangerous, the way removing armor from something powerful tends to make it more apparent what the armor was covering. "You bought out the restaurant," she said, sitting down. "Reserved," he said. "For a Saturday night." "I don't like interruptions." She smiled, not because she had decided to, but because the delivery was so completely without irony that it circled back around to being funny. He noticed the smile, and something shifted in his expression, a careful, almost private pleasure, like a man who had not expected to make someone laugh and found that he liked it considerably more than he'd anticipated. The dinner lasted 3 hours. A chef came to the table between courses, a small, intense man named Marco, who spoke to Dante in rapid Italian and glanced at Sloane with the open curiosity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. The food was extraordinary. Dante ate the way he did most things, deliberately, without rush, giving full attention to whatever was in front of him. He asked her about New Mexico again, and this time the questions were more specific, less conversational, the questions of someone who had been thinking about the answers from their last conversation and wanted to build on them.
She told him about the high desert in October, the way the light came in sideways and turned everything amber, the smell of pinon smoke from her mother's house in the early evenings. She was not performing these memories. They were real, all of them, and the fact that she was sharing them in this context, across a candlelit table from a man she was actively investigating, created a dissonance she absorbed without examining too closely. He told her unprompted that he had not done this in a long time. "Dinner?" she asked. "This," he said, and gestured at the space between them in a way that was neither elegant nor particularly articulate, but communicated something precise regardless. She understood what he meant. She chose not to say so directly. "You're not what I expected," she said instead. He looked at her. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure," she said. "Something less—" She paused, searching for the word that was honest without being too honest. "Something less present." He was quiet for a moment, turning his glass on the table. "Most people find it uncomfortable," he said, "the way I pay attention." "I'm not most people," she said. It came out simpler and more direct than she intended. Dante looked at her across the candlelight, and she held his gaze without difficulty, which was either professionalism or something else entirely, and she was no longer fully certain which. She drove home alone afterwards, parked in her building garage, and sat in the dark for a while. She did not call Brett that night.
The apartment in Brickell came 3 weeks after the dinner. Dante didn't present it as a gift. He was too precise for that kind of gesture, too aware of how it would land. He mentioned it the way he mentioned most things he had already decided, briefly, plainly, without leaving much room for the conversation to go anywhere other than forward. He knew someone who was relocating. The unit was furnished. The building was secure. It was closer to Sete than where she was currently living, which he somehow knew without her having told him. She raised an eyebrow. "You know where I live?" "I know a lot of things," he said, not threateningly, just factually. She moved in the following weekend. Brett called it a significant operational development and used the word excellent twice in the same briefing, which was twice more than Brett typically used any word that indicated enthusiasm. From a case standpoint, it was exactly that. The Brickell apartment sat 2 blocks from a property Brett had flagged 18 months ago as a financial relay point in the Calabrese network, and Sloane's proximity to Dante's daily patterns was producing intelligence at a rate that made the Coral Gables field office visibly excited in the way that federal field offices rarely permitted themselves to be. She provided 3 names in the first week alone, 2 account routing numbers by the second. By the end of the month, Brett told her that what she was building represented the richest single intelligence stream the ADTO had accessed in 6 years of pursuing the Calabrese network. She told him she was glad it was useful. Brett paused at that, a brief, almost undetectable hesitation that a less observant person would have missed entirely. "You doing all right?" he said. "Of course," she said. "Why?" "Just checking." It was the job of a good handler to ask that question periodically, and Brett was a good handler. Sloane understood the question and its implications, and gave him the answer that was accurate, and also the answer that allowed the operation to continue. She was fine. She was in control. She had complete clarity on the parameters of her role. All of this was true. What was also true was that Dante had learned her coffee order without asking, that he texted her, not called, texted, something Sal had told her in a rare candid moment that Dante did not do with anyone, at odd hours with observations that weren't requests for anything, just thoughts he apparently had and directed at her because she had become the person he directed things at. That when she laughed at something he said, the particular quality of his attention afterward made her understand, in a way she hadn't fully anticipated, why people followed this man without question.
Director Claudette Marsh flew in from Washington on a Tuesday.
She met Sloane at a coffee shop in Coral Gables without Brett, and ordered tea she didn't drink, and spoke the way women who had built careers in rooms that didn't originally want them in it tended to speak. Directly, without performance, every word load-bearing. "You're doing exceptional work," Marsh said. "I want you to know that's seen and noted at the highest level." "Thank you," Sloane said. "I also want to ask you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer." Sloane held her coffee cup and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "Where are you?" Marsh said. "Not geographically. Where are you with this?" Sloane looked at the woman across from her, the record, the sacrifices, the cases that had cost Marsh things she still didn't discuss publicly, and understood that this conversation was an act of professional care being offered by someone who had learned its value the hard way. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Sloane said. Marsh studied her for a moment. "The moment the line moves," she said quietly, "I need to know, not after, not during, before." Sloane nodded. Marsh left without finishing her tea. That same evening, Dante showed up at her apartment unannounced with takeout containers from a Japanese place in Wynwood she had mentioned once, in passing, 3 weeks earlier. He had remembered. He had done nothing with the information for 3 weeks and then acted on it as though no time had passed at all, which was so thoroughly characteristic of how his mind worked that she almost said so out loud. They ate on her balcony. Miami spread below them, loud and lit and indifferent. At some point, his hand covered hers on the railing, and neither of them moved for a long time. She laughed at something he said about the city, genuinely, unguarded and real, the kind of laugh that doesn't ask permission first. He looked at her afterward with an expression she felt in a place she had no professional language for. She did not move her hand. That night, alone, she opened her debrief template and stared at the cursor until the screen dimmed. Then she closed the laptop, walked to the window, and stood there watching the water for a long time before she was ready to go to bed. She told herself she was in control. She was only partially lying. The invitation came on a Friday morning. A text, 4 words, delivered with the same economy Dante applied to everything that mattered to him. Star Island, this weekend. No question mark, no elaboration, just the assumption, which by this point was not entirely unfounded, that she would come. She told Brett before she packed. "Star Island," Brett said. The way he said it carried the weight of 18 months of surveillance files, satellite images, and financial forensics pointing toward a property that the ADTO had photographed from boats and helicopters, but never accessed from the inside. "Sloane, this is—" "I know what it is," she said. "You'll need to document everything, layout, security rotations, access points. If we can get interior—" "Brett," she said his name once, quietly. "I know how to do my job." He was silent for a moment. "I know you do," he said. "Call me Sunday." She packed a weekend bag and drove to Star Island as the afternoon light turned the water gold. The estate was unlike anything she had prepared herself for, and she had looked at photographs. Photographs did not account for the quality of silence on the property, the way the gates closed behind her and the city simply stopped, like a sound being switched off at its source. The main house was white and severe and beautiful, facing the bay with the unself-conscious confidence of something built without needing to impress anyone.
Inside, it was cooler than she expected, the rooms high-ceilinged and sparsely furnished in the way that things are sparse when the emptiness is deliberate rather than absent. Dante met her at the door himself, no staff visible, no Sal, just him, in a linen shirt and bare feet on the marble floor, which was so dissonant with every version of him she had encountered in the outside world that she stopped in the doorway for a half-second before she could move again. "You look different," she said. "This is what I actually look like," he said, and took her bag before she could argue about it. He gave her the library before he showed her anything else. It was at the back of the house, overlooking the water, a long room with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a reading chair positioned precisely where the afternoon light came through the window at the most useful angle. Every book had been read. She could tell by the way they sat on the shelves, the particular looseness of spines that have been opened many times. She ran her finger along a row of them and pulled out a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, its cover worn soft with handling. "This one?" she said. He was leaning in the doorway, watching her. "Every few years," he said, "it says something different each time." "What does it say now?" He was quiet for a moment. "That waiting is its own kind of power," he said, "if you can survive it." She put the book back carefully and didn't say that she owned the same edition, same cover, same translation, a copy her father had given her the year before he died. She didn't say it because saying it would have cost her something she wasn't ready to spend.
The weekend dismantled her in ways she had not anticipated and could not entirely account for in any debrief. He cooked dinner Friday night with focused, misplaced confidence, a pasta that was technically correct and emotionally wrong, and refused to acknowledge that anything was imperfect about it. She ate every bite and said nothing, and he watched her with the suspicious satisfaction of a man who understood he was being managed, but didn't mind because he was being managed kindly. She washed up afterward while he stood beside her drying dishes, which his entire professional existence suggested should have been impossible. And they talked about nothing, films, weather, a book she was reading, in the easy, unhurried way of two people who have stopped performing for each other. Saturday, she read in the library while he worked. He came to check on her 4 times, each time with a different thin justification: coffee, a question about dinner, a book recommendation that could have waited, and each time she looked up from her page and found him in the doorway, looking at her with an expression she recognized by then, the one that meant he had walked into a room and found her there, and was briefly relieved in a way he hadn't yet learned to hide. Sunday morning, she awoke before him. She stood on the terrace in the early quiet, the bay flat and silver beneath a sky that hadn't decided yet what color it was going to be, and she let herself have the thought she had been refusing for weeks. "I don't want this to end." She stood with it for exactly as long as she could afford to. Then she went inside, made coffee, and when Dante appeared in the kitchen doorway with sleep-rumpled hair and the expression of a man surprised to find breakfast already happening, he looked at her across the kitchen like she was something he was terrified of losing. "Stay," he said. "Not the weekend, not another night, just the word itself, stripped of all its qualifications. Stay." She looked at him, standing there, powerful and barefoot, and completely unguarded in a way he would never have permitted anywhere else, and said yes. She called Brett that afternoon from the bathroom with the tap running. "I'm moving into the estate, deeper access. It makes operational sense." Brett said, "Good work, Sloane." He sounded genuinely pleased. She hung up and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Then she turned the tap off and went back to Dante. Living inside the life was different from observing it. Sloane had worked embedded operations before, had worn covers like second skins, had eaten at tables she was investigating, had laughed at jokes made by people she was building cases against. She knew the particular discipline it required, the constant internal separation between the person performing and the person watching the performance. She had always been good at maintaining that distance. It was, Brett had told her early in her career, her most valuable professional quality. The distance was not holding the way it used to. She and Dante had built something inside the estate that she did not have clean operational language for. A life, small and private and constructed from the kind of ordinary details that accumulated without announcement. Morning runs along the water's edge before Miami woke up, Dante matching her pace without complaint, though she suspected he found it slower than what he was used to. Arguments about films on the rare evenings he allowed himself to sit still long enough to watch one. The Sunday afternoon she spent teaching him her mother's recipe for red chile persol, walking him through it step by step in the kitchen while he listened with the focused seriousness he brought to everything, and the way he produced it the following Sunday without being asked, from memory, perfectly. That last one had cost her more than she showed. His world moved around her differently now than it had at Sete. She was not the bartender anymore, not staff, not peripheral. She was the person Dante Calabrese had chosen to keep close, which, in the architecture of his life, was a category occupied by almost no one. Sal watched her with the careful, measuring attention of a man whose entire professional existence was built around protecting something, and who was now trying to determine whether she was an asset to that thing or a threat to it. He was never rude, he was never warm, he was simply always watching, the way a well-trained dog watches a door. Two of Dante's other trusted associates, a financial operator named Vincent Reyes and a logistics man called Theo, who appeared to have no last name anyone used, had absorbed her presence with varying degrees of comfort. Vincent was pleasant in the transactional way of men who were pleasant with everyone as a professional strategy. Theo said very little and seemed to consider this sufficient. Dante introduced them to all of them as someone important. In his vocabulary, she had come to understand, this was the equivalent of a declaration. She transmitted the last major piece of intelligence Brett needed on a Wednesday morning, while Dante was in a meeting at the far end of the property. Account routing numbers tied directly to the upstream cartel connection, 3 layers deep, hidden beneath corporate structures that had taken the ADTO's financial forensics team 4 months to partially map. What Sloane provided completed the picture. Brett called her within the hour, and she stepped out to the terrace and kept her voice low and even while he told her what the numbers meant for the case. "We're ready to move to prosecution phase," Brett said. "This is it, Sloane. This is what we've been building toward." The bay was flat and bright below her. Somewhere inside the house, she could hear Dante's voice, measured, unhurried, handling whatever needed to be handled. "How long do you need?" Brett asked. She watched a boat move slowly across the water. 2 more weeks, she said. Brett paused. It was a brief pause, professionally neutral, but she had worked with him long enough to know what lived inside it. 2 weeks, he said. All right. She thanked him and hung up, and stayed on the terrace for a while after, her hands on the railing, the sun doing what Miami sun did in the late morning, pressing down on everything with an insistence that left no shadow. She told herself the 2 weeks were tactical. There were gaps in the financial map that additional proximity could close. There were names she hadn't confirmed. There were operational reasons, legitimate ones, for staying longer. All of this was true.
That evening, Dante found her in the library reading and sat across from her without a word, opening his own book, and they stayed like that for 2 hours in the particular silence that belongs exclusively to people who are comfortable enough with each other to stop filling the space between them. At some point, he looked up and found her already looking at him, and neither of them said anything about it. She went back to her page. She did not tell herself it was performance. She had run out of the energy required for that particular lie.
It was a Wednesday evening. She had made dinner, something simple, pasta and bread, the kind of meal that required attention without demanding it, and was coming in from the terrace where she had been watching the last of the light leave the bay when she pushed open the study door and found Dante at his desk. He didn't look up immediately. That was the first thing she noticed. Dante always looked up when she entered a room, not dramatically, not with the performed attentiveness of a man trying to demonstrate that he noticed her, but with the involuntary quality of someone whose body had decided, independent of instruction, to orient itself toward her presence. It was one of the things about him she had stopped being able to observe neutrally. He didn't look up, and the quality of his stillness was different. She understood before she saw it. The photograph was on the desk between them. Her ADTO badge photo, printed cleanly on plain paper, her name and division visible in the line beneath it. She recognized the image. It was 3 years old, taken at the Washington field office on a Tuesday morning when she'd had bad coffee and not enough sleep, and she remembered being mildly annoyed at how it had turned out. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. Then she looked at Dante. He raised his eyes to hers slowly, with the deliberate patience of a man who had been waiting for this moment and had decided exactly how he was going to occupy it. His face was not the face she had been bracing for without knowing she was bracing for it. Not cold, not controlled in the dangerous way, not the face he had shown Gerald, the port official, on a Thursday night in a back room somewhere. It was something else, something she didn't have a clean category for because she had not prepared for it. He looked tired, not physically, the other kind, the tiredness that accumulates in people who have been carrying something heavy and private and have simply reached the point where setting it down is the only available option. "How long?" she said. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks. She ran backward through 3 weeks of dinners and mornings and the library and the pasole he had made from memory. 3 weeks of him knowing completely and choosing to stay present in all of it, without alteration, without using it, without moving against her in any of the ways available to him, and the list of those ways was long. "You had me followed," she said. "Briefly," he said. "I needed to confirm what I already suspected." "And then you confirmed it." "Yes." "And you said nothing." He looked at her steadily. "I needed time," he said, "to decide what it meant." "What did you decide?" He stood then, slowly, without urgency, and moved around the desk. He stopped at a distance that was neither close nor far, the careful distance of a man who understood that the wrong movement in this particular moment would cost him something he could not recover. He reached past her and picked up the decanter from the side table. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass, the first real drink she had ever seen him take in all the months she had watched him order sparkling water in every room he occupied, and stood holding it, without drinking it.
"I decided," he said, "that it doesn't change what this is." She looked at him. "Dante, don't," he said, quietly, not harshly. "Don't tell me what it was. I know what it was when it started. I also know what it became. Those are two different things, and you know that as well as I do." The room was very quiet. Outside, the bay moved the way it always moved at this hour, patient and indifferent, the way water is when it has existed longer than everything around it. "You're not leaving," he said. "I need you to understand that. Not because I'll harm you. I want to be clear about that distinction. But because I'm not ready for this to be over, and I don't trust myself to let you walk out that door without—" He stopped, looked at the glass in his hand, set it down without drinking from it. "I just need time," he said. "A few days." She thought about Brett, the emergency protocols that would already be activating, the machinery of the operation grinding into its contingency procedures, red flags going up in a field office in Coral Gables, Director Marsh being briefed in Washington. She thought about the man in front of her who had known for 3 weeks and made her mother's pozole on a Sunday afternoon anyway. "If you keep me here," she said carefully, "there are people who will—" "I know exactly what will happen," he said. "I've known for a long time how this ends. I'm not confused about the situation." He looked at her then with a directness that she felt in the center of her chest. "I just wanted a few more days where we don't have to be what we are yet." Sloane stood in the doorway of the study in the quiet house on Star Island and looked at Dante Calabrese, the man at the center of a decade-long federal investigation, the man who cooked her mother's recipe from memory, the man who knew who she was for 3 weeks and chosen dinner over leverage every single time, and found that she had nothing to say that was both honest and safe. So she said nothing. Day 1, she tested the gates. Not dramatically. No running, no shouting, no performance of desperation. She walked the perimeter of the property in the early morning while Dante was inside, her hands in the pockets of the light jacket she had taken from the hook by the terrace door, and she assessed her situation the way she had been trained to assess every situation, methodically, without panic, cataloging what was available and what was not. What was not available, her phone, her credentials, any form of external communication, the gate code, and the particular freedom that came from being somewhere by choice. What was available, every comfort the estate offered, which was considerable. Her own room, not Dante's, a distinction he had made without being asked, with the quiet consideration of a man who understood that confinement and dignity were not required to be mutually exclusive. 3 meals a day that were better than anything she cooked for herself, the library, the terrace, the bay, visible but unreachable, and Dante himself, who worked during the days and appeared each evening at 7 for dinner with the punctuality of someone who had decided that whatever this was, it would be conducted with structure. She sat across from him the first night and ate in silence. He didn't push. He passed the bread and refilled her water and said nothing about what she was thinking or what she wasn't saying, which was its own form of pressure because it left her with no resistance to push against. By the 3rd night, she was talking. Not about the operation, not about Brett or the ADTO or the case file that had her name on every page. She talked the way people talk when the usual architecture of conversation has been removed, and what's left is just 2 people in a quiet house with nothing to perform for each other anymore. She talked about the drive from Albuquerque she used to take with her father on Sunday mornings, a particular stretch of highway where the desert opened up in a way that made you feel simultaneously very small and very free. She talked about the 6 months she had spent working a case that went nowhere and what it did to her, the specific loneliness of investing yourself completely in something that simply ends without resolution. Dante listened the way he had always listened, completely, without interruption, without the ambient distraction that most people brought to the act of hearing someone else. He asked one question when she finished, a small, precise question that indicated he had been paying attention to the parts she hadn't said out loud as much as the parts she had. She looked at him across the table. "You're very good at listening," she said. "Most people talk enough for both of you if you let them. I learned early it was more useful to hear what they were actually saying." "Is that a professional skill or a personal one?" He considered it. "Both," he said. "Originally professional. Now I'm not sure where the line is." She understood that more than she could say. On the 5th day, she asked him the question she had been building toward since the photograph. They were on the terrace after dinner, the bay going dark and the lights of Miami beginning their nightly argument with the sky. Dante had a coffee he wasn't drinking. She had her knees pulled up on the chair the way she sat when she wasn't thinking about how she was sitting. She said, "Did you know from the beginning?" He turned his coffee cup on the armrest. "I suspected from the 4th week," he said. "What gave it away?" "Nothing specific, nothing you did wrong. It was more," he paused, choosing carefully. "You were almost perfect, and people who are almost perfect in exactly the right ways are usually working at it." "Nothing specific, nothing you did wrong. It was more," he paused, choosing carefully. "You were almost perfect, and people who are almost perfect in exactly the right ways are usually working at it."
Most people wouldn't have kept coming back. "No," he agreed. "So why did you?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. The water moved below them. Somewhere across the bay, a boat sent its light in a slow arc across the dark. "Because it stopped mattering," he said finally. "Whatever you were doing there, it stopped being the thing I was thinking about when I thought about you. And I thought about you constantly." He said the last part without embarrassment, the way he said most true things, plainly, as though the truth was just geography, and there was no particular bravery in describing where you were standing. "That's never happened to me before." Sloane looked at the water. "I need you to know something, and I need you to hear it correctly." He waited. "The way I feel." She stopped, started again. There was a line between the assignment and what was actually happening, and I am not, she pressed her lips together, I am not able to tell you clearly where that line went. I've tried to find it, and I can't. I don't know what that means professionally. I know what it means personally. The terrace was very quiet. It means you're human, which is the one thing your organization was probably counting on you not to be. She laughed, a short, involuntary sound that surprised both of them. He looked at her when she laughed, the way he had always looked at her when she laughed, like it was something that happened to him rather than something he was observing. On the 7th night, she told him about her father. Not the cover version, not the edited, operationally safe summary she had given other people in other rooms over the course of this assignment. The real one. His name, the year, the particular Tuesday in November when she was 19 years old and the world reorganized itself permanently around an absence that has never fully filled in. Why she had spent her 20s pursuing people like Dante Calabrese after federal case files, not out of ideology exactly, but out of something more personal and less articulable, a need to impose order on a world that had revealed itself to be violently disordered when she was too young to absorb it cleanly. Dante listened without interrupting, without offering condolence or reframing or any of the things people offered when they were uncomfortable with grief and needed to move past it. He stayed present with it, completely, for the full duration of it, in a way she had not experienced from another person in a very long time. When she finished, he said nothing for a while. Then, "He would have been proud of you." It was simple and direct, and she was not been prepared for it.
She looked away at the water, and her eyes filled, and she let them without apologizing for it, which was something she almost never permitted herself in the presence of another person. He didn't move toward her, didn't make it smaller or larger, just stayed there in the chair beside her while she found her way back to herself. Later, lying in the quiet of her room, she stared at the ceiling and understood something with the particular clarity available only to people who have run entirely out of the lies they were telling themselves. She was going to spend a very long time getting over Dante Calabrese, possibly the rest of her life. She closed her eyes. Outside, the bay moved steadily against the shore, patient and indifferent, and entirely without advice.
He told her on the 10th day, morning, early, before the heat settled into the property and made the air heavy. Sloane was in the library with a book she hadn't been reading for the better part of an hour when Dante appeared in the doorway in a dark shirt, his phone in his hand, with the expression of a man who had arrived at the end of a very long internal argument and was prepared to announce the outcome. "I need to tell you something," he said. She put the book down. He sat across from her, not at the desk, not behind any surface that would have placed something between them, in the chair directly opposite hers, elbows on his knees, hands loosely joined. It was the posture of someone who had decided to be without armor for this particular conversation and was making the decision visible. "I called my attorney this morning," he said. She went very still. "Full cooperation," he said. "Everything. Names, accounts, routes, the upstream cartel contacts, the complete architecture." He said it the way he had built it, methodically, without drama, each piece placed deliberately. "I've already begun the process. By the time your organization has finished its emergency protocols and located you, there will be a negotiated agreement in place." Sloane looked at him. "Dante!" "I'm not finished," he said, quietly, not unkindly. She waited. "I've known for some time how this ends. Not the specifics, you, the photograph, this particular configuration of events, but the general shape of it. You don't build what I've built without understanding that the weight of it is cumulative, and that eventually the structure becomes more expensive to maintain than it is worth." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "I've been ready for a long time. I just hadn't found a reason that was sufficient." The library was very quiet. Outside the window, the bay was beginning to catch the morning light, going from gray to silver to something almost white. "You're the reason," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Not the case, not the pressure, not some strategic calculation about reducing a sentence. You, what this has been, what you are to me." He held her gaze steadily. "I'm not confused about who started this or why. I know exactly what you came to Sete to do. What I also know, what I am certain of in a way I've been certain of very few things, is that what happened between us is not something that can be explained entirely by the assignment. You know that as well as I do." She didn't deny it. She couldn't. Sitting in his library in the morning light, with her father's story still somewhere in the air between them from 3 nights ago. "I'm going to prison," he said. It was not self-pity. It was geography. The same plain, factual tone he used to describe everything true about his situation. "For a significant amount of time. My empire." He paused, and something moved briefly across his face. The first acknowledgement she had ever seen from him that dismantling 34 years of constructed power was not a neutral act. "My empire will be gone. My name will mean something different than it does now. All of that is already decided, and I've made my peace with it." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking you for one thing," he said. "It's not in any legal document. It's not part of any negotiation. It has nothing to do with the case."
He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, that particular quality she had first noticed at a bar on a Tuesday night, the quality of someone who actually registered what they were seeing. "Wait for me." The room held the words. Sloane looked at the man across from her, stripped of power, stripped of the empire, stripped of every layer that the outside world knew him by, and found what was underneath. Someone real, completely and painfully real, who had looked directly at everything she was and chosen her anyway, at a cost she was only beginning to fully understand. She thought about Brett, about Director Marsh, about the field office in Coral Gables, and the case file with her name on every page, and the career she had spent 7 years constructing with the same careful deliberateness that Dante had spent 34 years constructing his. She thought about Sunday mornings and Pasole and a reading chair positioned at precisely the right angle for afternoon light. "Okay," she said. One word, quiet, undecorated, the simplest form the answer could take. Dante nodded once, the nod of a man receiving information he had hoped for and not fully counted on, the nod of someone who understood the difference between a promise and a guarantee and was choosing to accept the former without demanding the latter. He didn't ask her to say it again. He didn't reach for her hand or close the distance between the chairs or do any of the things the moment might have accommodated. He simply sat with it, with her, in the quiet library, in the last morning of the life they had built inside the ruins of the one she had come to dismantle, and let it be enough. It was the most intimate thing she had ever witnessed. She looked away first, back to the window, back to the water going white in the morning light, and stayed very still while something inside her chest made a sound like a door closing softly in an empty house. She had meant it when she said it. She would spend a long time deciding whether that made everything better or infinitely worse. The gates opened at 6 a.m. Sloane stood in the foyer with her weekend bag, the same one she had packed for what was supposed to be a 2-day visit that had become something she still didn't have accurate language for, and watched 2 of Dante's attorneys move through the house with the quiet efficiency of people who had been briefed extensively and had many things to do before the morning was finished. Brett arrived 20 minutes later with 2 ADTO field agents she didn't recognize, and the particular expression of a man who had spent 10 days running emergency protocols and was still processing the fact that his agent was standing in the foyer of a Star Island estate looking entirely unharmed and not entirely relieved. He hugged her, brief and professional, one hand on her shoulder. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the way handlers looked at agents after extended embedded operations, checking for the things that didn't show on the surface. Whatever he found, he kept to himself. "We need to debrief," he said. "Today, all of it." "I know," she said. She didn't see Dante before she left. She had half expected to. Some final exchange in the foyer, some closing of the parentheses that the library conversation had opened. But Dante was already in a room at the far end of the house with his legal team, and the machinery of his surrender was moving with the same decisive momentum as everything else he had ever built, and she understood that there was nothing left to say between them that hadn't already been said in the library on a quiet morning with the bay going white outside the window. She picked up her bag and walked out through the gates and didn't look back at the house. She told herself that was a professional habit. Moving forward without looking back was something you learned in the first year of this work and never unlearned. Dante Calabrese walked into the Miami Federal Courthouse on a Monday. The sequence, when Sloane watched the security footage later in the Coral Gables field office, was almost entirely without drama, which is, she had come to understand, the most Dante thing about it.
No press, no spectacle, no performance of any kind. Just a man in a dark suit walking through a federal building with the unhurried steadiness of someone who had made a decision and was simply executing it. His attorneys flanked him. He spoke to no one else. The cooperation agreement was the most comprehensive the ADTO had received from any domestic trafficking organization in 11 years of operation. Every name, every account, every routing structure, every shell company, every cartel contact point from Miami to the upstream organizations in 3 countries. The financial forensics team in Washington called it a complete map. The phrase they used internally was surgical, meaning it didn't just identify the network, it explained it in Dante's own precise and exhaustive testimony from its origins to its present architecture. 47 arrests followed across 72 hours. 3 international cartel pipelines were severed at the connection points Dante identified with enough specificity that the DEA's International Division described the intelligence as unprecedented. The port infrastructure that had been moving product through South Florida for 9 years collapsed within a week as association after association was rolled up by federal teams working from the map Dante had provided. Sal Marzetti was arrested at his home in Coral Gables on a Tuesday morning. Vincent Reyes was taken from his office. Theo, whose last name turned out to be Tran, a detail that landed in the arrest report without ceremony, was picked up at Miami International before his flight boarded. The Calabrese's name disappeared from Miami's underground infrastructure with the speed that those who had spent careers trying to dislodge it found quietly stunning. The ADTO held an internal celebration at the Coral Gables field office on Thursday evening. Someone had brought a cake. Someone else had brought good bourbon. Director Marsh flew in from Washington and stood at the front of the room and spoke about the operation in the measured, precise language of someone who understood that the people in the room knew better than anyone what it had cost and didn't need it dramatized. She called Sloan forward. Sloan stood at the front of the room while her colleagues applauded, and Brett grinned from the second row, and Director Marsh shook her hand with both of hers and said, close enough that only Sloan could hear it, "You did something extraordinary here. I need you to know that clearly and completely." "Thank you," Sloan said. She smiled the entire time. It was not a performance. She was proud, genuinely, in the deep professional way that came from seeing 7 years of commitment to the work produce something real and significant. She had done her job. She had done it exceptionally well. Those were true things, and she held them honestly. She also stood at the edge of the room afterward while conversations moved around her and held a plastic cup of bourbon she didn't drink and looked at the wall and thought about nothing specific for a long time. Brett appeared beside her. "You should be celebrating," he said. "I am," she said. He looked at her sideways, said nothing, refilled his cup. That was one of the things she valued most about Brett, his capacity to know when the most useful thing he could offer was the absence of a question. She booked the flight that night, Albuquerque, one way, departing Friday morning. She packed her Brickell apartment in under an hour, which was approximately how long it had always taken because she had never fully unpacked, a habit from embedded work that she had never examined too closely until she was standing in a nearly bare apartment that she had lived in for months, and it looked like she had arrived yesterday. She left the key on the counter. The drive to the airport took her along the water, unavoidably given the geography, and she kept her eyes on the road and the radio on, and arrived 40 minutes early, which was also a habit. On the plane, she sat in the window seat and watched Miami fall away beneath her, the causeway, the bay, the islands arranged in the water like an afterthought, and stayed with the view until the city was small enough that she couldn't distinguish one part of it from another. Then she opened a book and read the same paragraph 4 times before she put it away and looked out the window at the clouds instead. She did not cry. She was absolutely fine. She watched the clouds for a long time. Her mother's house smelled exactly as it always had. Piñon wood and green chili, and the particular dusty warmth of a house that had been lived in by the same person for 30 years and had absorbed them completely. Sloane stood in the doorway with her bag, and her mother came from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and looked at her daughter, the way mothers looked at daughters who had been away too long, doing things they couldn't fully explain, with relief and questions she had the grace not to ask all at once. She slept for 3 days. Not continuously. She woke at intervals, lay in the dark of her childhood bedroom, listening to the desert silence, which was a different silence than Miami's silence, wider and older, and without the low, persistent hum of money moving underneath it. Then she slept again. Her mother brought food to the door and left it without knocking, which was the most loving thing anyone had done for her in recent memory. On the 4th day, she got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table while her mother moved around her, and they talked about everything except Miami, and nothing except ordinary things: the neighbors, the weather, a cousin's new baby, the green chili harvest that had been better than expected this year. It was the most restorative conversation she had in months, precisely because nothing in it required her to be anything other than someone's daughter eating toast at a kitchen table in Albuquerque. She stayed 6 weeks. The first promotion came in the 4th month. Senior Field Operative, Washington Field Office. Director Marsh called her personally, which was not standard procedure, and communicated more than the promotion itself. Sloane accepted, thanked her, and spent the afternoon walking the neighborhood around her Albuquerque apartment. She had taken a short-term lease near her mother while she decided what came next, and came home and called Brett. "DC," he said. "Good, you belong there." "Don't make it sentimental," she said. "Too late," he said. "Already done." She laughed and hung up and started packing. She was efficient about it. She was always efficient about packing. Washington was gray in the way that cities built around power tended to be gray, not colorless, but weighted, the sky sitting low over wide federal avenues with the authority of something that had been there longer than the buildings beneath it. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building 3 blocks from the mall, with a window that looked out onto a parking garage, which she found oddly comforting in its lack of pretension. She was exceptional at her job, and everyone said so. She knew it was true, and was genuinely proud of it in the way she had always been proud of doing difficult things well. She mentored 2 junior agents, contributed to 3 ongoing operations, and was present at the close of a trafficking case in New Orleans that Brett called one of the cleanest prosecutions he'd seen in his career. Director Marsh recommended her for the 2nd promotion 8 months after the first. The morning it was confirmed, Brett flew up from Miami for the occasion, which was not nothing, given how much Brett disliked flying, and they had dinner at a place near the office that had good wine and no television screens, and they talked for 3 hours about everything, and Dante Calabresi's name did not come up once. She was grateful for that in a way she didn't say out loud. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. She found it in the bottom drawer of her desk. She didn't know how it had gotten there, whether someone had placed it without comment, or whether the building's mail routing had simply deposited it quietly among things that required no immediate action. No return address. Beaumont, Texas postmark. Her name written in handwriting she recognized immediately and completely, the same precise and unhurried hand that had once pointed her toward a book about waiting being its own kind of power. She held it for a long time, turned it over twice, the way you handle something you are not ready to open but are also not ready to put down. She thought about the library on Star Island and the morning light on the water, and a man sitting across from her in a chair with his elbows on his knees, saying, "Wait for me," in the plain, direct way he said every true thing. She thought about the promise. She put the envelope in the bottom drawer and closed it. The second promotion was announced at a Friday morning all-hands. Her colleagues applauded, and someone brought pastries, and Director Marsh stood at the front of the room looking at Sloane with the particular expression of a woman who had given a great deal to this work and recognized the same quality of giving in someone else. Afterward, Sloane took the elevator to the parking garage. She got into her car. She set her bag on the passenger seat and her hands on the wheel, and sat in the low concrete quiet of the garage while the fluorescent lights did what fluorescent lights did. Flickered almost imperceptibly, the kind of flickering you only noticed when everything else was still. She was not crying. She was not reading the letter, which was 4 floors above her in a bottom drawer. She was just sitting with the specific and particular silence of a woman who had done the right thing completely and correctly and at great cost, and who was still, 8 months later, in the ongoing process of understanding what the right thing had taken from her in exchange for the doing of it. She thought about Dante in a federal corrections facility in Beaumont, Texas, patient in a way he had never needed to be before, waiting with the same focused stillness he brought to everything, believing in a promise made in a library on a morning that felt from this distance like it had happened to a different version of her. She thought about the woman who had made that promise. She thought about the woman sitting in the parking garage. She was not sure they were entirely the same person anymore, and she was not sure what to do with that, and she suspected she would be not sure for a long time yet. She straightened, picked up her bag, got out of the car with the decision already made, because it had always been already made. She understood that now, had perhaps understood it on the plane, watching Miami disappear into cloud, had maybe understood it even earlier, in the library, in the moment before she said the word okay and meant it, and began the long work of living with having meant it. She took the elevator back up. She walked past the bottom drawer without stopping. She went to work.
Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. It keeps these Mafia legends alive. Like, comment, and I'll see you in the next upload.